Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of London to Ladysmith via Pretoria by Winston S. Churchill. Today, 125 years ago, the future Prime Minister was escaping from a prison camp of the Boers in South Africa. We shall follow his footsteps as he narrates his adventures himself. Subscribe to our channel so as not to miss anything. Chapter 11, I Escape from the Boers. Lourenço Marques, December 22, 1899.
How unhappy is that poor man who loses his liberty? What can the wide world give him in exchange? No degree of material comfort, no consciousness of correct behavior, can balance the hateful degradation of imprisonment. Before I had been an hour in captivity, as the previous pages evidence, I resolved to escape. Many plans suggested themselves, were examined, and rejected. For a month, I thought of nothing else. But the peril and difficulty restrained action. I think that it was the report of the British defeat at Stormberg that clinched the matter. All the news we heard in Pretoria was derived from Boer sources and was hideously exaggerated and distorted. Every day we read in the Volksstem, probably the most astounding tissue of lies ever presented to the public under the name of a newspaper, of Boer victories and of the huge slaughters and shameful flights of the British. However much one might doubt and discount these tales, they made a deep impression. A month's feeding on such literary garbage weakens the constitution of the mind. We wretched prisoners lost heart. Perhaps Great Britain would not persevere. Perhaps foreign powers would intervene. Perhaps there would be another disgraceful, cowardly peace. At the best, the war and our confinement would be prolonged for many months. I do not pretend that impatience at being locked up was not the foundation of my determination, but I should never have screwed up my courage to make the attempt without the earnest desire to do something, however small, to help the British cause. Of course, I am a man of peace. I did not then contemplate becoming an officer of irregular horse. But swords are not the only weapons in the world. Something may be done with a pen. So I determined to take all hazards, and indeed, the affair was one of very great danger and difficulty. The state's model schools stand in the midst of a quadrangle and are surrounded on two sides by an iron grill and on two by a corrugated iron fence about 10 feet high. These boundaries offered little obstacle to anyone who possessed the activity of youth, but the fact that they were guarded on the inside by sentries 50 yards apart, armed with rifle and revolver, made them a well-nigh insuperable barrier. No walls are so hard to pierce as living walls. I thought of the penetrating power of gold, and the sentries were sounded. They were incorruptible. I seek not to deprive them of the credit, but the truth is that the bribery market in the Transvaal has been spoiled by the millionaires. I could not afford with my slender resources to insult them heavily enough. So nothing remained but to break out in spite of them. With another officer who may for the present, since he is still a prisoner, remain nameless, I formed a scheme. After anxious reflection and continual watching, it was discovered that when the sentries near the offices walked about on their beats, they were at certain moments unable to see the top of a few yards of the wall. The electric lights in the middle of the quadrangle brilliantly lighted the whole place, but cut off the sentries beyond them from looking at the eastern wall, for from behind the lights all seemed darkness by contrast. The first thing was therefore to pass the two sentries near the offices. It was necessary to hit off the exact moment when both their backs should be turned together. After the wall was scaled, we should be in the garden of the villa next door. There our plan came to an end. Everything after this was vague and uncertain. How to get out of the garden, how to pass unnoticed through the streets, how to evade the patrols that surrounded the town, and above all, how to cover the 280 miles to the Portuguese frontiers, were questions which would arise at a later stage. All attempts to communicate with friends outside had failed. We cherished the hope that with chocolate, a little Kaffir knowledge, and a great deal of luck, we might march the distance in a fortnight, buying mealies at the native kraals and lying hidden by day. But it did not look a very promising prospect. We determined to try on the night of the 11th of December, making up our minds quite suddenly in the morning, for these things are best done on the spur of the moment. I passed the afternoon in positive terror. Nothing, since my school days, has ever disturbed me so much as this. There is something appalling in the idea of stealing secretly off in the night like a guilty thief. The fear of detection has a pang of its own. Besides, we knew quite well that on occasion, even on excuse, the sentries would fire. 15 yards is a short range, and beyond the immediate danger lay a prospect of severe hardship and suffering, only faint hopes of success, and the probability at the best of 5 months in Pretoria gaol. The afternoon dragged tediously away. I tried to read Mr. Lecky's History of England, but for the first time in my life that wise writer wearied me. I played chess and was hopelessly beaten. At last it grew dark. At 7 o'clock the bell for dinner rang, and the officers trooped off. Now was the time. But the sentries gave us no chance. They did not walk about. One of them stood exactly opposite the only practicable part of the wall. We waited for 2 hours, but the attempt was plainly impossible, and so with a most unsatisfactory feeling of relief to bed. Tuesday the 12th, another day of fear, but fear crystallizing more and more into desperation. Anything was better than further suspense. Night came again. Again the dinner bell sounded. Choosing my opportunity, I strolled across the quadrangle and secreted myself in one of the offices. Through a chink, I watched the sentries. For half an hour, they remained stolid and obstructive. Then all of a sudden, one turned and walked up to his comrade, and they began to talk. Their backs were turned, now or never. I darted out of my hiding place and ran to the wall, seized the top with my hands, and drew myself up. Twice I let myself down again in sickly hesitation, and then with a third resolve scrambled up. The top was flat. Lying on it, I had one parting glimpse of the sentries, still talking, still with their backs turned, but I repeat, 15 yards away. Then I lowered myself silently down into the adjoining garden and crouched among the shrubs. I was free. The first step had been taken, and it was irrevocable. It now remained to await the arrival of my comrade. The bushes of the garden gave a good deal of cover, and in the moonlight their shadows lay black on the ground. 20 yards away was the house, and I had not been 5 minutes in hiding before I perceived that it was full of people. The windows revealed brightly lighted rooms, and within I could see figures moving about. This was a fresh complication. We had always thought the house unoccupied. Presently, how long afterwards I do not know, for the ordinary measures of time, hours, minutes, and seconds are quite meaningless on such occasions, a man came out of the door and walked across the garden in my direction. Scarcely 10 yards away, he stopped and stood still, looking steadily towards me. I cannot describe the surge of panic which nearly overwhelmed me. I must be discovered. I dared not stir an inch. My heart beat so violently that I felt sick. But amid a tumult of emotion, reason, seated firmly on her throne, whispered, "Trust to the dark background." I remained absolutely motionless. For a long time the man and I remained opposite each other, and every instant I expected him to spring forward. A vague idea crossed my mind that I might silence him. "Hush, I am a detective. We expect that an officer will break out here tonight. I am waiting to catch him." Reason, scornful this time, replied, "Surely a Transvaal detective would speak Dutch. Trust to the shadow." So I trusted, and after a spell another man came out of the house, lighted a cigar, and both he and the other walked off together. No sooner had they turned than a cat pursued by a dog rushed into the bushes and collided with me. The startled animal uttered a meow of alarm and darted back again, making a horrible rustling. Both men stopped at once, but it was only the cat, as they doubtless observed, and they passed out of the garden gate into the town. I looked at my watch. An hour had passed since I climbed the wall. Where was my comrade? Suddenly I heard a voice from within the quadrangle say, quite loud, "All up!" I crawled back to the wall. 2 officers were walking up and down the other side, jabbering Latin words, laughing and talking all manner of nonsense, amid which I caught my name. I risked a cough. One of the officers immediately began to chatter alone. The other said slowly and clearly, "Cannot get out. The sentry suspects. It's all up. Can you get back again?" But now all my fears fell from me at once. To go back was impossible. I could not hope to climb the wall unnoticed. Fate pointed onwards. Besides, I said to myself, of course I shall be recaptured, but I will at least have a run for my money. I said to the officers, "I shall go on alone." Now I was in the right mood for these undertakings. That is to say that, thinking failure almost certain, no odds against success affected me. All risks were less than the certainty. A glance at the plan will show that the rate which led into the road was only a few yards from another sentry. I said to myself, "Toujours de l'audace," put my hat on my head, strode into the middle of the garden, walked past the windows of the house without any attempt at concealment, and so went through the gate and turned to the left. I passed the sentry at less than 5 yards. Most of them knew me by sight. Whether he looked at me or not, I do not know, for I never turned my head. But after walking 100 yards and hearing no challenge, I knew that the second obstacle had been surmounted. I was at large in Pretoria. I walked on leisurely through the night, humming a tune and choosing the middle of the road. The streets were full of burghers, but they paid no attention to me. Gradually I reached the suburbs, and on a little bridge I sat down to reflect and consider. I was in the heart of the enemy's country. I knew no one to whom I could apply for succor. Nearly 300 miles stretched between me and Delagoa Bay. My escape must be known at dawn. Pursuit would be immediate, yet all exits were barred. The town was picketed, the country was patrolled, the trains were searched, the line was guarded. I had 75 pounds in my pocket and 4 slabs of chocolate, but the compass and the map which might have guided me, the opium tablets and meat lozenges which should have sustained me, were in my friends' pockets in the state's model schools. Worst of all, I could not speak a word of Dutch or Kaffir, and how was I to get food or direction? But when hope had departed, fear had gone as well. I formed a plan. I would find the Delagoa Bay Railway. Without map or compass, I must follow that in spite of the pickets. I looked at the stars. Orion shone brightly. Scarcely a year ago, he had guided me when lost in the desert to the banks of the Nile. He had given me water. Now he should lead to freedom. I could not endure the want of either. After walking south for half a mile, I struck the railroad. Was it the line to Delagoa Bay or the Petersburg branch? If it were the former, it should run east. But so far as I could see, this line ran northwards. Still, it might be only winding its way out among the hills. I resolved to follow it. The night was delicious. A cool breeze fanned my face, and a wild feeling of exhilaration took hold of me. At any rate, I was free, if only for an hour. That was something. The fascination of the adventure grew. Unless the stars in their courses fought for me, I could not escape. Where, then, was the need of caution? I marched briskly along the line. Here and there, the lights of a picket fire gleamed. Every bridge had its watchers. But I passed them all, making very short detours at the dangerous places, and really taking scarcely any precautions. Perhaps that was the reason I succeeded. As I walked, I extended my plan. I could not march 300 miles to the frontier. I would board a train in motion and hide under the seats, on the roof, on the couplings, anywhere. What train should I take? The first, of course. After walking for 2 hours, I perceived the signal lights of a station. I left the line, and circling round it, hid in the ditch by the track about 200 yards beyond it. I argued that the train would stop at the station and that it would not have got up too much speed by the time it reached me. An hour passed. I began to grow impatient. Suddenly, I heard the whistle and the approaching rattle. Then, the great yellow headlights of the engine flashed into view. The train waited 5 minutes at the station and started again with much noise and steaming. I crouched by the track. I rehearsed the act in my mind. I must wait until the engine had passed, otherwise I should be seen. Then I must make a dash for the carriages. The train started slowly, but gathered speed sooner than I had expected. The flaring lights drew swiftly near. The rattle grew into a roar. The dark mass hung for a second above me. The engine driver silhouetted against his furnace glow, the black profile of the engine, the clouds of steam rushed past. Then I hurled myself on the trucks, clutched at something, missed, clutched again, missed again, grasped some sort of handhold, was swung off my feet, my toes bumping on the line, and with a struggle seated myself on the couplings of the 5th truck from the front of the train. It was a goods train, and the trucks were full of sacks, soft sacks covered with coal dust. I crawled on top and burrowed in among them. In 5 minutes, I was completely buried. The sacks were warm and comfortable. Perhaps the engine driver had seen me rush up to the train and would give the alarm at the next station. On the other hand, perhaps not. Where was the train going to? Where would it be unloaded? Would it be searched? Was it on the Delagoa Bay line? What should I do in the morning? Never mind that. Sufficient for the day was the luck thereof. Fresh plans for fresh contingencies. I resolved to sleep, nor can I imagine a more pleasing lullaby than the clatter of the train that carries you at 20 miles an hour away from the enemy's capital. How long I slept, I do not know, but I woke up suddenly with all feelings of exhilaration gone, and only the consciousness of oppressive difficulties heavy on me. I must leave the train before daybreak so that I could drink at a pool and find some hiding place while it was still dark. Another night I would board another train. I crawled from my cozy hiding place among the sacks and sat again on the couplings. The train was running at a fair speed, but I felt it was time to leave it. I took hold of the iron handle at the back of the truck, pulled strongly with my left hand, and sprang. My feet struck the ground in 2 gigantic strides, and the next instant I was sprawling in the ditch, considerably shaken but unhurt. The train, my faithful ally of the night, hurried on its journey. It was still dark. I was in the middle of a wide valley, surrounded by low hills, and carpeted with high grass drenched in dew. I searched for water in the nearest gully, and soon found a clear pool. I was very thirsty, but long after I had quenched my thirst, I continued to drink, that I might have sufficient for the whole day. Presently, the dawn began to break, and the sky to the east grew yellow and red, slashed across with heavy black clouds. I saw with relief that the railway ran steadily towards the sunrise. I had taken the right line, after all. Having drunk my fill, I set out for the hills, among which I hoped to find some hiding place, and as it became broad daylight, I entered a small grove of trees which grew on the side of a deep ravine. Here, I resolved to wait till dusk. I had one consolation. No one in the world knew where I was. I did not know myself. It was now 4 o'clock. 14 hours lay between me and the night. My impatience to proceed, while I was still strong, doubled their length. At first it was terribly cold, but by degrees the sun gained power, and by 10 o'clock the heat was oppressive. My sole companion was a gigantic vulture, who manifested an extravagant interest in my condition and made hideous and ominous gurglings from time to time. From my lofty position I commanded a view of the whole valley. A little tin-roofed town lay 3 miles to the westward. Scattered farmsteads, each with a clump of trees, relieved the monotony of the undulating ground. At the foot of the hill stood a Kaffir kraal, and the figures of its inhabitants dotted the patches of cultivation or surrounded the droves of goats and cows which fed on the pasture. The railway ran through the middle of the valley, and I could watch the passage of the various trains. I counted 4 passing each way, and from this I drew the conclusion that the same number would run by night. I marked a steep gradient up, which they climbed very slowly, and determined at nightfall to make another attempt to board one of these. During the day, I ate 1 slab of chocolate, which, with the heat, produced a violent thirst. The pool was hardly half a mile away, but I dared not leave the shelter of the little wood, for I could see the figures of white men riding or walking occasionally across the valley, and once a Boer came and fired 2 shots at birds close to my hiding place. But no one discovered me. The elation and the excitement of the previous night had burnt away, and a chilling reaction followed. I was very hungry, for I had had no dinner before starting, and chocolate, though it sustains, does not satisfy. I had scarcely slept, but yet my heart beat so fiercely, and I was so nervous and perplexed about the future that I could not rest. I thought of all the chances that lay against me. I dreaded and detested more than words can express the prospect of being caught and dragged back to Pretoria. I do not mean that I would rather have died than have been retaken, but I have often feared death for much less. I found no comfort in any of the philosophical ideas which some men parade in their hours of ease and strength and safety. They seemed only fair-weather friends. I realized with awful force that no exercise of my own feeble wit and strength could save me from my enemies, and that without the assistance of that high power which interferes in the eternal sequence of causes and effects more often than we are always prone to admit, I could never succeed. I prayed long and earnestly for help and guidance. My prayer, as it seems to me, was swiftly and wonderfully answered. I cannot now relate the strange circumstances which followed, and which changed my nearly hopeless position into one of superior advantage. But after the war is over, I shall hope to lengthen this account, and so remarkable will the addition be that I cannot believe the reader will complain. The long day reached its close at last. The western clouds flushed into fire. The shadows of the hills stretched out across the valley. A ponderous Boer wagon, with its long team, crawled slowly along the track towards the town. The Kaffirs collected their herds and drew around their kraal. The daylight died, and soon it was quite dark. Then, and not till then, I set forth. I hurried to the railway line, pausing on my way to drink at a stream of sweet, cold water. I waited for some time at the top of the steep gradient in the hope of catching a train. But none came, and I gradually guessed, and I have since found that I guessed right, that the train I had already traveled in was the only one that ran at night. At last I resolved to walk on, and make, at any rate, 20 miles of my journey. I walked for about 6 hours. How far I traveled I do not know, but I do not think that it was very many miles in the direct line. Every bridge was guarded by armed men. Every few miles were gangers' huts. At intervals, there were stations with villages clustering round them. All the veldt was bathed in the bright rays of the full moon, and to avoid these dangerous places, I had to make wide circuits and often to creep along the ground. Leaving the railroad, I fell into bogs and swamps and brushed through high grass dripping with dew, so that I was drenched to the waist. I had been able to take little exercise during my month's imprisonment, and I was soon tired out with walking, as well as from want of food and sleep. I felt very miserable when I looked around and saw here and there the lights of houses, and thought of the warmth and comfort within them, but knew that they only meant danger to me. After 6 or 7 hours of walking, I thought it unwise to go further, lest I should exhaust myself, so I lay down in a ditch to sleep. I was nearly at the end of my tether. Nevertheless, by the will of God, I was enabled to sustain myself during the next few days, obtaining food at great risk here and there, resting in concealment by day and walking only at night. On the 5th day, I was beyond Middelburg, so far as I could tell, for I dared not inquire nor as yet approach the stations near enough to read the names. In a secure hiding place, I waited for a suitable train, knowing that there is a through service between Middelburg and Lourenço Marques. Meanwhile, there had been excitement in the state's model schools, temporarily converted into a military prison. Early on Wednesday morning, barely 12 hours after I had escaped, my absence was discovered, I think by Dr. Gunning. The alarm was given. Telegrams with my description at great length were dispatched along all the railways. 3,000 photographs were printed. A warrant was issued for my immediate arrest. Every train was strictly searched. Everyone was on the watch. The worthy Boshoff, who knew my face well, was hurried off to Komati Poort to examine all and sundry people with red hair traveling towards the frontier. The newspapers made so much of the affair that my humble fortunes and my whereabouts were discussed in long columns of print, and even in the crash of the war, I became to the Boers a topic all to myself. The rumors in part amused me. It was certain, said the Standard and Diggers News, that I had escaped disguised as a woman. The next day I was reported captured at Komati Poort, dressed as a Transvaal policeman. There was great delight at this, which was only changed to doubt when other telegrams said that I had been arrested at Brugsbank, at Middelburg, and at Bronkerspriet. But the captives proved to be harmless people after all. Finally, it was agreed that I had never left Pretoria. I had, it appeared, changed clothes with a waiter, and was now in hiding at the house of some British sympathizer in the capital. On the strength of this, all the houses of suspected persons were searched from top to bottom, and these unfortunate people were, I fear, put to a great deal of inconvenience. A special commission was also appointed to investigate stringently, a most hateful adjective in such a connection, the causes which had rendered it possible for the war correspondent of the Morning Post to escape. The Volkstem noticed as a significant fact that I had recently become a subscriber to the State Library and had selected Mill's essay on liberty, It apparently desired to gravely deprecate prisoners having access to such inflammatory literature. The idea will, perhaps, amuse those who have read the work in question. I find it very difficult, in the face of the extraordinary efforts which were made to recapture me, to believe that the Transvaal government seriously contemplated my release before they knew I had escaped them. Yet, a telegram was swiftly dispatched from Pretoria to all the newspapers, setting forth the terms of a most admirable letter, in which General Joubert explained the grounds which prompted him generously to restore my liberty. I am inclined to think that the Boers hate being beaten even in the smallest things, and always fight on the win, tie, or wrangle principle, but in my case I rejoice I am not beholden to them, and have not thus been disqualified from fighting. All these things may provoke a smile of indifference, perhaps even of triumph, after the danger is past. But during the days when I was lying up in holes and corners, waiting for a good chance to board a train, the causes that had led to them preyed more than I knew on my nerves. To be an outcast, to be hunted, to lie under a warrant for arrest, to fear every man, to have imprisonment, not necessarily military confinement either, hanging overhead, to fly the light, to doubt the shadows. All these things ate into my soul and have left an impression that will not perhaps be easily effaced. On the 6th day, the chance I had patiently waited for came. I found a convenient train duly labeled to Lourenço Marques, standing in a siding. I withdrew to a suitable spot for boarding it, for I dared not make the attempt in the station, and, filling a bottle with water to drink on the way, I prepared for the last stage of my journey. The truck in which I ensconced myself was laden with great sacks of some soft merchandise, and I found among them holes and crevices by means of which I managed to work my way to the inmost recess. The hard floor was littered with gritty coal dust and made a most uncomfortable bed. The heat was almost stifling. I was resolved, however, that nothing should lure or compel me from my hiding place until I reached Portuguese territory. I expected the journey to take 36 hours. It dragged out into 2.5 days. I hardly dared sleep for fear of snoring. I dreaded lest the trucks should be searched at Komati Port, and my anxiety as the train approached this neighborhood was very great. To prolong it, we were shunted onto a siding for 18 hours, either at Komati Port or the station beyond it. Once indeed they began to search my truck, and I heard the tarpaulin rustle as they pulled at it, but luckily they did not search deep enough, so that, providentially protected, I reached Delagoa Bay at last, and crawled forth from my place of refuge and of punishment, weary, dirty, hungry, but free once more. Thereafter, everything smiled. I found my way to the British consul, Mr. Ross, who at first mistook me for a fireman off one of the ships in the harbor, but soon welcomed me with enthusiasm. I bought clothes, I washed, I sat down to dinner with a real tablecloth and real glasses, and fortune, determined not to overlook the smallest detail, had arranged that the steamer Induna should leave that very night for Durban. As soon as the news of my arrival spread about the town, I received many offers of assistance from the English residents, and lest any of the Boer agents with whom Lourenço Marques is infested should attempt to recapture me in neutral territory, nearly a dozen gentlemen escorted me to the steamer armed with revolvers. It is from the cabin of this little vessel, as she coasts along the sandy shores of Africa, that I write the concluding lines of this letter, and the reader who may persevere through this hurried account will perhaps understand why I write them with a feeling of triumph, and better than triumph, a feeling of pure joy.
This concludes today's reading of London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, by Winston S. Churchill. Join us also on December 24th for the subsequent chapter. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thanks for listening, and so long.